First of all, I just want to have a little comment on a term that you may have heard, NoSQL. It's kind of a category that Redis and various other sort of databases that don't use SQL get lumped into. I don't really like that term. It kind of feels almost confrontational, you know, no SQL, saying SQL is bad. And, it's kind of, yeah, so there's a lesson to be learned behind the marketing term. It's basically about understanding your data. Sometimes SQL isn't the best thing. Sometimes, I thought it was a 40-minute talk. 40? Yeah. I'm trying to shortchange this. Okay, so yeah, so basically having a bit more control over the technology that you're using to store your data can be a good thing, but you need to understand how you're storing your data, whether it's SQL or not. So that kind of is it. Kind of a very old saying, but you know, it's so Maslow's law. It's tempting if the only thing you have is a hammer, treat everything as if it were a nail. So if the only thing you have is a SQL database, you treat everything as relational data, and it's not all relational data, so maybe NoSQL is a better way for storing some data, and then there's lots of different ways of storing it. Okay, with that, let me go on to Redis. So it's a key value store. It's a big store of data in memory, basically. It sounds very simple, and actually it is. You have a key, and it has a global namespace, so you've got really a very large hash table, and it provides various commands for dealing with the data you've got in that hash table. So it calls itself a data structure subset, like I said. It's a hash table at the top level, and then it only really lets you go one level deep. So you've got the key, which has a name, so you know, food or something, and then you've got some data associated with that, which can be various different types. But it doesn't let you go more than one level deep. I'll explain that a bit more. So yeah, it's usually all in memory. So the idea is that your data set is not a huge amount of data you've got on disk, although there is some work in Redis on making it work for those cases. But generally, what you'll do is you'll have a server in Redis with a lot of memory in it, and that will then store the data, and other services will query that. Yeah, so it's a simple protocol written in C with limited dependencies. So to compile it is actually quite simple because you just need the basic C library and it bundles the other dependencies it needs. It does simple operations. So like I was saying, if you've got a string, you do a get and set on, for example, and I'll get to that. So I can't claim credit for this, but someone called it the AK-47 of databases, and I thought it was quite amusing. So an AK-47 is easy to repair, easy to use, I assume. I've never actually used it myself. I hear you can around here, try a minute. So the other AK-47 needs a lot of ammo. We just need a lot of memory. What else do I have to say? Yeah, and it's a very simple database. So AK-47 is simple. So that's how you compile it. Obviously, if you're not on Debian, then appropriate way to get the things you need to run Git and make little dependencies for C programs. So it should work anywhere. Well, actually, anywhere Perl does. I don't know if it works in some of the more esoteric platforms, but it should, because it's very basic C. So easy to use. You don't actually even need a config file, so if you just run it like that, it will run in the background, you can then connect to it. And then, like I was saying, set and get kind of the two most basic operations. So literally, if I just connect to it here, set to set space, get so as you can see, it doesn't really care if it's not there, it's just not there, and actually if a key doesn't exist, it's just nil. But food is a string at 42, so very simple. So I don't know how well you can see that, but like I was saying, there's different commands. So get and set are kind of the two basic ones on strings, and then whether you can see those, there's hashes, lists, sets, sorted sets, and a few other bits and pieces. So if you're using it, that website is kind of the guide you need to know what commands there are, because there are a lot of commands for different sort of specialised purposes. So, like I was saying, it's simple. Code-wise, it's about 20,000 lines of C. And just for comparison, Postgres is something like 870,000 lines of code. It's quite big anyway. And that's the protocol. It's very simple. You generally don't actually want to talk directly to it, but if you do, then it's just a quite simple text-based protocol, but it has the length included in there, so you can actually use Python data without it being issued. So I'm going to cover several different uses now. I'll cover them separately, but if you're building an application, you'll probably combine several different things to make something useful out of it. So, caching. So you've hopefully heard of Memcached, which is almost the same thing as Redis at this level. It's an in-memory cache of data. Redis lets you do a bit more, but you can very easily take Memcached, replace it with Redis to start with, and then go on from there if that's how you want to use it. One of the advantages is that the cache can actually persist in Redis rather than being totally in memory. So if you've got data that it takes some work to generate when the box dies and then everything restarts, and then you suddenly realise that you don't have enough capacity to regenerate the data that you've got in Memcached, you can avoid that situation if needed. So, I don't know how we can see that at the back. It's slightly smaller than I expected. So this is a factorial function. So the core of it is there, literally factorial times factorial minus 1. But what it does first is it looks at a key called fact colon, and this sort of colon is a convention that some people use. It's kind of up to you how you split up the namespace, but like I said, it's a global namespace. Yeah, you split up keys how you want. So one way is sort of the thing, and then a colon for actually the subset of what you want to use it. So in this case, F would be a number. The code obviously is a bit simple. He's actually checking that, so it doesn't care. But it's assuming that that will be a number. So if that's there already, it's got an answer, and it returns it to you. And if it doesn't have it, then it sets it down here, and when it sets it, it will store that, and then next time someone asks for the factorial of that particular number, it will give them back from the cache rather than the calculator. Obviously, it's a bit of a contrived example, but hopefully it makes sense. So one thing this doesn't do is deal with expiring. There's sort of two ways of doing that. You can tell Redis to automatically evict keys once they've come to being used after a certain time, and it will just get rid of them if it runs out of memory. Or you can manually use a command called expire, which you can see doesn't expire. So you can, for a particular key, you can set a key's time to live in seconds, and then it will go and delete that key when it's no longer needed. It kind of does that in a lazy way, so it's not looking at keys to delete all the time. It just realises, oh, I need some memory, so I'll go and get some. So for that example before, literally just add in this one line here, expire, and then it will go and expire that key after an hour. Obviously, whether that actually makes sense for this, I don't know, but like I said, it's a contrived example. so far, the getting set operating on a string, which is effectively the same sort of scale in Perl. There's some other types, so there's list, which is basically like an array in Perl, hash, which is hash, and then it gets a bit more valued with the kind of making comparisons to Perl. So set is a set of things that are the same that don't have a value. So it's like a hash, for example, in Perl, where you just set a thing to one kind of convention for things that exist in a set that you don't care about what the value is, but it supports that natively and supports some native operations on those. And then a sorted set is actually quite an interesting thing. I've said it's sort of like ix hash, so if you're not familiar with that, it's a hash where it remembers the order things are added. It's not quite that. I couldn't really figure exactly which type order it's like, but it basically remembers a number, which is called a score, that's associated with the set. So then you can ask it back for the set in the order of the score. So, for example, if you've got some photos and you've got views, you might store the photo ID and the number of views in a sorted set. Then you can ask it for the top 10 items in this set, and it will tell you this is the top 10 most viewed photos or whatever you want to do with that data. So there was something a bit like that earlier. You might have seen a queue. It's basically a list in reality, and one of the operations on a list is lpop, which is just take an item off a list, much like pop in Perl. So first of all, if you've got a queue, you push some data on, and it does this rpush lpop. So rpush is actually a normal push in Perl, whereas lpop is also a normal pop in Perl, but there's also the other way around. There's lpush, which is actually unshift in Perl, and there's there's rpop, which is no, sorry, yeah, it's shift unshift, yes. Yeah, and then if you pop off that queue, you then get the data that you put on the queue. So that's really simple to use. It's a little bit different to using it as a third array, but because this is Redis server is sort of a shared data structure server, any app can come along and push onto that queue, another app can come along and pull off it. There's also an operation called bpop, and then it's got the right and left types of that as well, and that means blocking. So you can actually go to it, say block, and then when someone pushes something into that queue, it will then return you the data, so you don't have to hold the server constantly to get your item off your queue. So you can, if you want to use it as a queue, do it just like that. It's got support for that. So kind of indexes, it doesn't really support those natively, but like I said, there's a sorted set, which lets you basically come up with quite a few different data structures that you can then use for index lists. So it's up to you to maintain them separately from your data. So what you probably have is some sort of data access layer in Perl that knows how to maintain the indexes as well as the data that you're putting in the server. So, for example, this is a hash. So I mentioned photos and views earlier, so I'm going to use that as an example again. Here you've got the name of the key, and then you've got a name here and a value. So, kind of, one thing about Redis is actually, although it's not a relational database, you still have to think a bit about sort of the schema. There's no enforced schema, but you obviously need to design your data in a way that it's understandable and you can access it in the way you want. So here there's actually two caches at the top level, which are URLs and views. So there's an ID of 123 of an actual photo in my hypothetical photo database, and then I've got a URL to it of 123.jpg and a number of views here, so it's been viewed 6 times. And now you'll notice that actually it's sort of split, so that you're accessing via the top level, you're saying what you want to access, and then you're saying the photo you want to access, and then you're getting the actual data. So kind of those two bits of data are almost swapped around. But this means you can actually use Redis commands in a sensible way and not result in sort of getting your data in a weird way and then have to deal with it and parse it into the client side. So here I'm getting all the views. So you'll notice I'm just assigning this straight into the Perl hash, and that's because Redis is actually quite Perlish in a way. So when you do hgetAll, it just returns you a name, a value, a name, a value, which if you assign straight to the Perl hash, actually just works, and Perl quite happily lets you assign it to that hash. And then this zadd is Z is sort of the Redis convention for sorted sets. So anything beginning with Z is doing the sorted set. So what I'm doing is I'm sorting this hash that I just fetched out on views, and then I'm adding that into the sorted set. Except I've got that code wrong. What I should have there is a map as well. So what the idea would be is that you have the name and then the value of it. I'll fix that in some slides somewhere later. But the idea is that you've got a view, so you have the ID and then the number that's associated with that view in a sorted set, and then you can use some commands, such as, for example, zrange by score. This is where you really have to use the command docs, because there's quite a lot of rather complex commands. So Redis doesn't really do transactions in the ACID sense, but for example, if you've got some data in it, there are different ways that it could be updated. So it supports something called watching and then sort of multi-exec. So what you do is you say, watch this foo, so that's watch a particular key, and then multi starts a transaction, which actually almost defers the execution of the commands in the middle here. So then when you do exec, it actually runs them all. But because I've done that watch on foo, if someone else comes along and changes it before I execute that transaction, it will just not run the transaction. So you can, through that, you can basically get it so that if something happens, you just retry the transaction and hopefully it'll work the second time. So it's kind of optimistic transaction terms there. And hopefully Anton is going to talk later more about some of that stuff in terms of migrating from a relational database. Sorry.
Is that watch name foo arbitrary?
So no, that's the name of the key that you're looking at here. So if someone comes along and modifies that particular key, then it will throw it out. It's assumed that you're going to use it down here, but you don't have to, because it could be that you've got something where you're dependent on a variable you've read and then you're saving it to another one. So the transaction is dependent on the variable you watch, but you're not actually using it later on. It's sort of, like I said, it Redis basically makes it up to you how you actually use your data, so it provides quite low-level commands, and then you do what you want with them. So there's quite a few Perl modules. These are kind of ones I've come across. There's also a few others on CPAN. So Redis kind of on its own is sort of the obvious module, obviously named. And almost all of these modules basically take the Redis commands and just map them straight into Perl. So using them is actually quite simple. For example, here, Redis command args, and then the arguments, and so forth. So actually, you don't really need to, once you've worked out how to call these particular modules, you don't really need to read their documentation. You just look at the Redis online docs and just basically pass straight through those modules. And in fact, most don't actually have knowledge of commands, they just pass them straight through. That's kind of not true on some of the more complex commands because they need to support a few special cases and things.
But is there any reason to have 4?
I'll come to that. So Redis is kind of, the pure Redis one is sort of asynchronous access. And one of the advantages of Redis is it's actually quite fast. So one that I'm sort of involved with is any event Redis, which provides asynchronous access. You'll notice here there's a sub. So if you get foo, then this sub is called with the parameters that the command is passed, so actually the value of foo in that case, which means you can actually run quite a few commands at once, and then it'll get all the results and handle them. So it's called pipeline. Basically, it depends exactly what you're doing, but for example, if you've got a lot of data, you then don't have to wait for the round trip to and from the Redis server. You can just get a load of data, and then the callbacks here will be called in the appropriate place, and you can deal with the data as you see fit. If you're familiar with any event, there's also a way you can call a receive method on this, so it will actually block at that point if it needs to. So if you do need to have some kind of synchronization within the methods you're calling, then you can actually do that. And then a bit of an experiment of mine is tie Redis. So for example, I don't know how well you can see that. So, sorry. So I've asked for $foo, and it's just at 42. So actually, what this is doing is it's tying the Redis straight into Perl, because as I mentioned, the data structures are quite close to Perl. So I sort of use this as a command shell for Redis, and it's quite nice in a way because you can literally just treat it as if it's a sorry, that's not how it works. So there I've set something called app bar and put that in, and then if I quit this and start it again, and then ask for the contents of that, it then tells me what the contents are. So it's a bit of a mind read, but I quite like it. It makes a bit of a nicer interface than the Redis command line interface itself, so you can do interesting things.
Can you actually use these?
Yeah, so actually, unfortunately, because keys is a Perl function, you can't actually do that directly. Okay. But I can't remember what I called it. Yeah. So there, for example, I've just run a Redis command key start, and then it showed me the keys. So this is actually something called app Redis P, which is something that uses the tie Redis module, and it's a bit of a work in progress, but I kind of think it's quite neat. And there's a little evil trick to actually make this work. You'll notice that it's, if you know how tie works in Perl, you can't normally tie with the top level namespace, so it actually compiles the code and looks at the variable names that you've used and then ties them behind the scenes and then runs the code. So it's a bit scary, but for use in kind of just a command line app like this, I sort of feel like the app to do that, and it's not too sorry, for some reason I have to change back to the way mouse pointer to something. So one other module that is kind of under development and various things are using is protocol Redis, which the idea is to abstract the low-level access to the protocol. So if you wanted to use that in another module, or maybe even use the Redis protocol for another purpose, it's there, and other modules that implement Redis can use this underneath. And then, in theory, you can then write fast representation. So I wrote a protocol Redis XS, which uses Hi Redis, which is the client library written by the author of Redis. So that, in theory, means that it's doing it in C and will be a bit faster. Actually, in reality, it's probably not really worth it unless you're doing a lot of traffic to Redis, because the cost of talking to a database server is nothing compared to actually the other things your app is doing. But it's there as an option. So I've kind of gone quite fast through some of this. I'm sorry. One thing that I haven't mentioned is PubSub. So, for example, you might be familiar with the concept from other things. So you can send a command and basically subscribe to a channel, and then you get the things that are sent through that channel. So it might be easier if I can show you an example. So what I can do is I can subscribe to something called Hi.
You might want to clear your screen so it's at the top.
So if I subscribe to that, okay, so here, the first message was when I subscribed, and then it said message to channel hi, hello. Now, that seems really quite basic, I know, but what you can then do is actually use something like JSON and send more data in that string, and basically use it almost like the queuing thing I mentioned earlier, but it's a bit more real time, because you subscribe to it, and then multiple subscribers can subscribe to it. So some of you might have seen this, which is something I wrote, and behind the scenes, this is using Redis. So what it does is it searches CPAN. So, for example, I'm searching CPAN for the regex. This should work, but apparently. So the idea of this is you can search the whole of CPAN with regexes, and behind the scenes, it's actually using quite a lot of Redis. So here you'll see it's publishing to a channel saying error regex is too greedy, because something broke to the regex that was obviously a bit too greedy in this case. And then the actual interesting thing is at the end here, it publishes the results, which is built up a list of here. Now, one of the interesting things about this is actually it's using the sorted sets behind the scenes. So in order to make this fast, what I have to do is basically concatenate bits of CPAN together into chunks of 10 megabytes, and then I run a regex across those and search for some data. And then when I get a match, I look where in the file that match is and use a sorted set to search for that offset in bytes. And in the sorted set, what I've actually got is a name of the actual original file that that data came from. So it means I can search through a lot of files and then use Redis as an index to say where did this actually come from. So there obviously are other ways of doing that, but kind of with this, it's actually really quite simple to see where the you can't see the lookup code there, but basically by asking it where a score for a particular file is, I can then get back to the original. It's quite a nice use of Redis, I think, because it's simple, but it's actually doing quite a lot for me. Writing that kind of thing in I mean, I suppose I could have used a SQL database and just done an index lookup on the offset, but SQL databases are effectively have an index and things like that. This is quite nice work. So admin commands, I mentioned earlier about saving databases. So there's a command literally save, except one of the problems with that is it actually blocks the whole process when it does save. So obviously that's not ideal if you're using a database that's actually being queried at the same time. So there's kind of, like I said, it's really about Redis giving you the tools to do it, and then there's various options for how you actually save the data yourself. So one way, for example, is that you can replicate the data to another instance, and then it's safe to call save on that because you're not reading from it. Or there is actually a bg save command, which is quite nice because actually it forks the process, and because everything is in memory, it then has a copy of the data at the point it forked, and they can just run save in that other process, and it then goes through and saves it to disk. And finally, the other way is that you can actually ask it to write a transaction log, and then you can save every so often, and then just replay the log and get back to the database to how it was. So obviously, that if you actually want it to be sort of more real time, like an actual database would be, that was the way to do it. But it's still not quite as safe as a real SQL database. So there are ways, but by the time you actually start saving the time, you might actually better off using a SQL database, which kind of goes back to what I said at the start. That there's more than one way to do it, and it depends what you're doing. So the Redis is definitely useful for caching and that kind of thing for sure. Right, so some useful links. That's the command documentation that I mentioned. Definitely something to look at. And then the Redis module, any event Redis. Well, basically, I'm very sure if you go to CPAN and...
What do you type in CPAN grep for search to this page? Or the previous page? You type. This will should work?
So if you actually go to the About page, there's some examples, and that's one of the examples. So if you
work on, okay, thank you.
Yeah. The network seems to have broken. So I was going to just search for Redis on CPAN, but unfortunately. And then Anti-Res is the author of Redis, and he's got some quite interesting articles on his blog about implementing different things, and there's quite an interesting article on there about implementing something a bit like Suggest, I think. So that's definitely worth reading.
Maybe do you have the slides?
I will put them somewhere, yes. I'll update this talk's thing with a link to the slides. Yeah, updated them. And I was quite amused by this. After I see this, do you have any expertise in SQL? No. So, that's a right expertise in NoSQL. So, that's all. If you've got any questions or anything.
I might not have understood everything. Is it possible to use this as a replacement non-cache?
Yes, definitely.
How do you store an object? Store or serialize it?
Yeah, so it's up to you. So quite a lot of people use JSON just because it's there. And the nice thing if you use something like JSON is it can be cross-language, and then you don't have to worry about only being able to use storable with Perl, for example. But really, there's something else called message pack, which is quite interesting because that gives you a binary serialization format that is actually cross-platform. So I know some people have used that.
Message pack?
Yeah. So a while ago, So this is something I did ages ago that is kind of a very silly benchmark of different serializers. So message pack actually kind of for that one is probably the number to look at, is actually quite fast, but JSON XS can actually be faster in some cases. And obviously it depends a lot on the data you're doing, so that's a really important piece of benchmark, but maybe.
And you can load balance Redis across multiple servers?
Yes, so I mean it's up to you how you do it. So the way some people do is sort of shard it and divide it by some value, that kind of thing. And yeah, it's really up to you. There's also a clustering mode which is sort of under development.
So if you have a working memcache, what would be the advantage of replacing it with Redis? I mean, is it simpler?
It possibly is a bit simpler. There might not actually be any advantage. You know, why change something that works? But one of the things I didn't say is that persisting does exist for Redis. So actually, if you were to get into a situation where the data in memcached actually takes some time to generate, then you can restart Redis and the data will still be there, but it will still take expires and things into account. So you're not kind of, you wouldn't be serving stale data, but you might get a bit of a performance benefit when you restart. Maybe that doesn't happen very often. It depends a lot on your activity.
Can you make backups with consistent state?
Yes, so like I was saying, the save blocks the server totally, so nothing runs while that happens, so that will be consistent.
Well, yeah, I mean, sure.
Obviously, if you've got multiple servers where you're sharding, then that's a bit more interesting. I'm not sure how you'd have to do something to do that yourself. So.
Can you do multi-get and multi-set?
Yes, there's commands for that.
And how quick is it compared to memcache?
So I've heard that it's faster, but I've not benchmarked it and take that with a total compared to memcache.
I've got here a table compared to DB5. Redis compared to DB5, and it can be much faster than DB5, but it can also be much slower.
Yeah, okay, cool. Thank you everyone for the
Não consegui fazer direito aqui, experimento no por causa das condições, não consegui fazer direito. E eu só adicionar
I'm just getting lots and lots of questions. Yeah, we're trying very fast. That's rubbish. Okay. Yeah.
yeah.
Right, so you're fine.
Okay.
Always the best thing to do. See you later.
Thanks, David.
Yeah, I was sitting over there and just...
Não sei, eu não tenho que fosse porque eles não estão.
Yeah, it's like I said, it's a bit of an experiment. I quite like the idea because it feels that Redis is close enough to Perl that it should be possible, but there's often cases where it doesn't quite work.
I was actually surprised to hear this.
Mind if we open Windows for a few minutes? Because it's a bit stuffy in here.
The back row where we can really cause trouble.
He didn't swear.
He did before his call. Just barely. That's not going to work.
So CRNS has wrapped the
Sorry?
CRNS has wrapped the
Okay.
He hasn't exposed the network.
What kind of PDFs are you converting?
I got more chocolate.
Get rid of that.
Oh, that project. I've heard of a lot of people doing that. Hello, Karen.
I know.
It just means you have to be real directly to the rest of
Yes, a lot of people have done that, and I definitely didn't do it. I definitely wasn't going to do it.
Of course not.
I definitely won't do it now. Especially now there's potential in Perl.
Oh, really?
Like, well, why bother going to that click on in 5 minutes? I don't release it today. It's doomed.
Sure. If you don't release it today, it's doomed. I'll buy that.
Okay, the password.
Also, you're talking to Sheila. Back to Germany, around and now. Any other option other than this required me to use their phone. And when I was making the reservation, there was a storage that might not be around. So I decided to go. See, understandable.